At the will reading, my parents gave my sister $10 million and told me to go earn my own. Then Grandpa's lawyer stood up and read a secret he kept just for me. My dad started screaming. I'm Alyssa, 24 years old, and I grew up in a spacious two-story house in the northern suburbs of New York State, with a backyard big enough to host weekend barbecues. From the outside looking in, everyone thought our family was the picture of perfection. Successful parents, 2 lovely daughters, a fluffy dog named Cooper, and a brand new SUV parked out front. But inside those cream-painted walls was a world where every glance, every word, every ounce of affection tilted only in one direction. From a very young age, I understood that in this house, Emma was the one who was cherished, and I was the one who had to learn how to sacrifice. Emma was 2 years younger than me, but ever since she could speak, she'd been called the little princess of the house. She had her own room painted pastel pink, with crown-printed curtains and an entire shelf full of dolls and stuffed animals gifted by our parents on every birthday. And me? My room was half the size, painted a dull gray, and held nothing more than a single bed, an old desk, and a bookshelf I'd repainted with watercolor back in 3rd grade. The only time I ever got a stuffed animal was when I had a fever for 3 days straight, a discounted toy from a thrift shop. Mom handed it to me and said, "You have to learn to appreciate what you have." Emma's birthdays were always grand events held in fancy hotels, with 3-tiered cakes, Disney princess themes, professional photographers, and once even a woman dressed as Elsa singing live. Mine, on the other hand, usually meant a quiet dinner at home with a small cake Mom grabbed last minute from the supermarket. No balloons. No extravagant gifts. For years, I wrapped books as presents for myself, placed them on the table, and pretended to be surprised when I opened them. When I once asked Mom why she didn't throw parties for me like she did for Emma, she patted my head and said, "You're older now. Being frugal is a virtue. Let's save the fun for your little sister." 1. I was always a good student. Every semester, I brought home certificates of excellence, straight-A report cards, math awards, reading contests. But my parents' praise was limited to a few words. "Yeah, we know. You're supposed to be good." But when Emma posted an off-key singing clip on TikTok and got a few hundred views, the whole house lit up. Dad shared the video on Facebook with the caption, "Here's the artist of the family." Mom gave Emma an expensive toy microphone and said, "You were born to shine, sweetheart." And me? I once won a gold medal in a statewide science competition. When I told Dad, he barely looked up from his newspaper and casually said, "That's nice. But don't forget to do the dishes tonight. Your mom's tired." I wasn't jealous of Emma. I didn't hate her. But I hated the feeling that I always had to be the one who understands more, spends less, gives way. Since I was 10, the phrase, "You're the older sister, so," became the opening line of every conversation at home. "You're the older sister, so you need to give in. You're the older sister, so you should set an example. You're the older sister, so take care of yourself." But not once did anyone say, "You're the older sister, and you deserve to be loved too." Gradually, I learned to stay silent. I stopped bragging about my grades. I stopped asking for anything on my birthday. I stopped expecting compliments or attention. I shrank into a shadow inside the very house I once called home. I became good at enduring, good at listening, good at giving, but increasingly unfamiliar with what it felt like to be loved unconditionally. And in all those quiet moments, there was only one person who made me believe I was worth more, my grandfather, Samuel. But he was a quiet man, and I never expected that what he left behind for me would change my life forever. I still remember vividly the scent of old books and black tea in Grandpa Samuel's small house, a single-story home at the end of a maple-lined street, where everything was as neat as something out of an old novel. He'd lived there alone ever since Grandma passed away, and even after many years of retirement, he kept the same habits, wearing a crisp white shirt, a dark silk tie, and reading the newspaper at precisely 7 each morning. To outsiders, Samuel was a stern, reserved old man, a once-renowned litigation lawyer in New York for over 3 decades. But to me, he was the only one who had ever truly seen me not with scorn or indifference, but with a gaze that made me feel like I was something worth remembering. Since I was 8, Mom often sent me to Grandpa's house every weekend, mostly so she and Emma could have their girly time together, going to the spa, shopping, taking family photos I was never a part of. But I never felt bothered. Because in that small house, I could breathe. I could be still. I could be myself. Grandpa wasn't a man of many words, but he always placed a second teacup on the table the moment I walked in. No scripted greetings, no hollow praise. Just a quiet pour of tea and a gesture toward the chair across from him. "Did you bring a book, Bright One?" Bright One. That's what he called me, ever since the day I learned to read faster than the other kids in class. He said not everyone loves to read, but those who love words often know how to love themselves, too. When I turned 10, he gave me my first real book, not a children's story, but Thinking, Fast and Slow, by Daniel Kahneman. It was thick, dense, filled with complex ideas. But he didn't give it to me like a child's gift. He gave it like a declaration of belief. You're smarter than they think. Don't let the way they treat you make you doubt that. We used to play chess every Saturday afternoon, the ticking of the old clock filling the silence of the room. Every move he made had intention. And whenever I misstepped, he wouldn't correct me, he'd simply ask, "Are you sure about that?" Over time, I learned to see more than one step ahead, to think deeper than a single word, to sense the unspoken silences within myself. Sometimes, he'd tell me stories from the courtroom tales of people who were right but lost because their voices weren't loud enough, and others who were wrong but praised because they knew how to hide the truth. I once asked him, "Then where's justice, Grandpa?" He just gave a faint smile, eyes distant, and said, "Justice doesn't come from blind love. It comes from the courage to stand up when you've been cast aside." That sentence stayed with me long after, even when I didn't fully understand it at the time. Grandpa never spoke ill of anyone in the family. He never intervened, never contradicted my mother when she scolded me for not being perfect enough, or when Emma stole the spotlight during holidays. But his eyes always held a quiet gentleness when they met mine, as if he were saying, "I see it. I understand. I can't change them, but I believe in you." And that alone was enough strength for me to keep going. A few times, I overheard Mom telling Dad's getting old. He doesn't need to be so strict with Alyssa. But what they didn't know was that it was exactly his strictness that made me feel respected. Not like a child who needed coddling, but like someone who could think for herself, make her own choices, walk her own path. When I turned 12, he had me write down 3 life goals, then urged me to sign it. Your first contract with yourself. And whenever I accomplished something, he never made a fuss. He simply nodded and said, "One step closer." I didn't know what Grandpa had left for me in that letter, but if I had ever learned how not to beg for recognition, it was because of him. If I knew how to get back up after every wound without turning myself into a victim, it was because he planted the first seed. And if I sit here today not crying, not angry, not breaking, it's because I remember with perfect clarity the last line he ever wrote to me in a simple birthday card: "You don't need to be chosen to shine. You just need to keep walking in the dark, and the light will find you." I started working at 16, while my classmates were busy planning for prom or debating what color dress to wear. I got a job at a small coffee shop downtown, a place that smelled of fresh pastries in the morning and turned dead silent after 8 p.m. On my first shift, I stood at the sink washing mugs for 3 straight hours, my hands shriveled like overboiled bamboo shoots. But I didn't complain. Every dollar I earned was one step closer to freedom. I kept a written log of every expense, saved every single cent in a glass jar hidden under my bed. Not because I was poor, but because I didn't want to owe anyone anything. I didn't want to be called a freeloader in my own house. I chose finance as my major not because I wanted to be rich, but because I realized early on that money was the only language the adults in my family truly respected. My father, a mid-level manager at an interior design firm, always believed women should study feminine things, things that made them easier to marry off. When I got accepted into a pre-college business program in financial management, he smirked and said, "Why study all that? It's not like we're short on money. Or are you planning to be some CEO someday?" My mother sat beside him in silence. No one asked me why I chose that major, why I stayed up night after night until my eyes blurred. They only saw my effort as odd, as unusual. In contrast, Emma dropped out 3 times in 2 years and still got consolation parties. Every time she switched majors from drama to fine arts, then to fashion design, my parents called it self-discovery. When Emma said she wanted to go to France to find artistic inspiration, they sold part of their stock portfolio to fund the trip. "She needs new experiences to grow," my mother said. But when I asked for money to pay for the SAT registration fee, Mom sighed and said, "Can't you ask your teacher if there's a scholarship for that?" I didn't blame them. I just stayed quieter, worked harder. Outside of school hours, I picked up extra shifts cleaning the school library, tutored underclassmen in math, even babysat on weekends. Some days, I juggled 3 jobs, came home exhausted and aching, only to be told I still had to do the dishes because Mom said, "You're the older sister. Housework is your responsibility." On nights when I dozed off on my desk, I often dreamed of a different life, one where I didn't have to prove I deserved it. In 12th grade, I applied for a full-ride scholarship. I prepared the application entirely by myself, wrote the essays alone, filled out every single FAFSA form without anyone in the house even knowing. I didn't dare tell my parents because I knew they would only say, "You think you're capable of that?" And then, on a gloomy March day, I got the acceptance email from Wharton, the most prestigious finance program in the country. I didn't cry. I just stood frozen in front of my computer, lips trembling from joy, disbelief, and loneliness. Because I knew, in that moment, no one in my family would truly grasp what it meant. That evening, I folded the acceptance letter neatly, placed it on the dinner table, and said firmly, "I got a full scholarship. I'll be moving to Philadelphia this fall." No one clapped. No one hugged me. Dad took a long sip from his glass, then chuckled, "Smart girl, but you waited this long to say it? Well, at least it won't cost us anything." Mom didn't smile. She just asked, "Then who's going to drive Emma to school if you're not here?" I clenched my teeth. I wanted to scream, "I'm not a chauffeur, not a babysitter." But I stayed silent. I understood then in their eyes, I would never be a source of pride. I was merely the fallback when needed, the one who took over house chores whenever Emma was busy being creative, the daughter they never wanted to invest in, yet always expected to endure. And because of that, I decided I would leave. Not just to study far away, but to break free from the role of the good, obedient daughter that I had been forced to play for the first 20 years of my life. I wouldn't ask for permission. I wouldn't announce it. I would simply walk away quietly, gently, and never look back. Because I knew, if I didn't step out of that cage, no one in that house would have ever believed I had wings. I was standing by the window on the 14th floor of the Glass and Cohen building, a financial investment firm in the heart of New York, when my phone buzzed. A strange number lit up the screen, and when I answered, the woman's voice on the other end spoke gently. "I'm sorry, I'm calling from Greenwood Nursing Home. We regret to inform you. Mr. Samuel Whitmore passed away this morning." In that moment, the city skyline outside the Glass turned hazy and unreal. I couldn't speak. I just stood there in silence, gripping the phone tightly, my chest hollow. I thought I was used to loss, used to not belonging anywhere, but this time was different. He had been the only one who ever truly saw me, who ever listened without judgment. And now, he was gone. I caught the earliest train back to town. The ride took over 3 hours, winding through forests bathed in autumn reds, but I felt nothing except the crushing weight in my chest. When I arrived home, Mom looked up and said, "Oh, you're back. The funeral's at 10 tomorrow morning, don't be late." No hug. No questions about how I'd been living, how work was going, whether I was okay. Emma was in the middle of curling her hair, phone in hand, giggling as she scrolled. "Don't wear anything too old and black, okay? There'll be local press at the service," she said with a smirk. I looked at my sister and didn't know what to say. While I was choking on every silent wave of grief inside me, everyone here was prepping for another performance, a perfect family show. The funeral took place at the old church Grandpa used to bring me to on holidays. But today, the place was packed with strangers, camera flashes blinking nonstop, and most of the attention fell on Emma, the heir to the family name. She wore a tight black dress, oversized sunglasses, and now and then dabbed at her eyes in theatrically timed gestures. My parents sat in the front row, chatting with familiar faces, while I was placed in the back, like a distant acquaintance. No one asked where I was working. No one knew I had just completed an internship at one of the top firms on Wall Street. To them, I was still just Alyssa, the quiet one, the underwhelming one, the one who never gave them anything to brag about. As the casket was carried outside, I stood alone beneath a maple tree, the breeze slipping through my thin coat, making me shiver but not from the cold. I watched him one last time and whispered in my heart, "I'm sorry for not saying goodbye in time." As the crowd slowly dispersed, my parents and Emma were surrounded by condolences and familiar arms, while I quietly made my way toward the parking lot like a ghost. I didn't know what I was hoping for, only that something inside me still refused to let go. 3 days after the funeral, I received a strange call. A deep, composed male voice spoke on the other end. "Hello, this is Harold Cartwright, Mr. Samuel's private attorney. He mentioned you in his will. We'll be holding the reading next week. We hope you can attend, as there are certain items he left specifically for you." For a split second, my heart pounded. A part of me wanted to believe that he hadn't forgotten me. That even if the rest of the world had erased me from the family portrait, he had still left a period, a mark just for me. Something not made of money, but made of recognition. A way of saying, "I see you." I nodded, even as my throat tightened. "Yes, I'll be there." For the first time in years, something faint stirred inside me, hope, and I had long forgotten what that felt like. The room where the will was to be read was inside an old red brick building in the center of town, each brick steeped in time and silence. Light streamed in through tall windows, casting a thin, golden thread across the long wooden table. I sat at the far end, quiet, fingers intertwined beneath the table, while the rest of my family, my father, mother, and Emma, claimed the head of the table as if they were the honored guests of some prestigious award ceremony. Emma wore a chic cream-colored suit, her hair in soft curls, nails polished to match, eyes gleaming with anticipation but not a trace of worry. My mother carefully adjusted the collar of my father's shirt, like everything was playing out exactly as planned. Attorney Harold Cartwright sat at the other end, slowly flipping through neatly clipped documents in a leather folder. He glanced at each of us before speaking in his calm, steady voice. "As per the wishes of Mr. Samuel Whitmore, we will now proceed with the formal reading of the will, signed on February 12th, 3 years ago." No one said a word. I kept my eyes fixed on the table, my nerves stretched tight like a wire, though my face remained unreadable. I didn't expect much. I only hoped for something, anything, to prove I wasn't invisible in his final memories. First, Harold began. Mr. Samuel bequeaths his entire lakeside estate in Vermont, along with all personal memorabilia, artwork, and the antique jewelry collection, to his granddaughter, Emma Whitmore. I saw Emma tilt her head slightly, unsurprised. My mother pressed her lips together to hide a triumphant smile. My father nodded in approval, patting Emma's chair with satisfaction. Harold continued. In addition, the investment portfolio valued at $10 million will be transferred in full to Miss Emma. A small sound escaped. I wasn't sure if it came from me or from deep inside my chest. I looked over at Emma. She raised an eyebrow and glanced back at me with a look that was calm, detached, but unmistakably proud. The look of someone who had won a race I was never even allowed to start. "Next," Harold said, his voice dropping slightly. To the second granddaughter, Alyssa Whitmore. I held my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was screaming to be seen, to matter. Mr. Samuel leaves a final message. Learn to be self-reliant. It is the greatest asset a person can own. The room fell into silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to collapse from the ceiling straight onto my shoulders. I slowly lifted my head, eyes glazed, staring at Harold, hoping he had misread something. But he only gave a soft nod, as if he had just completed the last sentence of a formal announcement. An assistant placed a single sheet of paper in front of me, cleanly typed, with just one italicized line. Self-reliance is the only path to freedom. No name, no signature, nothing but emptiness. My father exhaled, as though checking off his final obligation. He turned to my mother and smiled contentedly. My mother glanced at me once, then turned away. Emma caught my gaze, shrugged, and whispered, "Guess he didn't think you'd ever amount to much either." I clenched the paper in my hands. Didn't cry, didn't smile. I just felt myself slowly slipping out of that room, as if my body was still seated there, but my spirit had vanished. As if I had never really existed in their hearts. And if I had existed in his, then why did everything have to end with a message so hollow? I stood up quietly. No one stopped me. No one called me back. But just as I turned to leave, that voice rang out from the far end of the room, from a shadowed corner no one had paid attention to. "Please wait a moment," the man said, his tone calm but carrying the weight of something unfinished. "There's one part that hasn't been announced, a part Mr. Samuel kept private, and it's meant for Miss Alyssa only." The entire room seemed to freeze. My father jerked his head around. Emma blinked. And me. I stood still, but my heart had started to beat again. Not out of hope, but because for the first time that day, I heard my name spoken not as a rejection but as a return of something that had been denied for far too long. All eyes in the room turned toward Harold as he gently pushed back his leather chair and stood, a sealed envelope in his hand. His hand was steady, but his voice grew slower, as if he was carrying something heavier than any financial worth. With permission, I will now read the supplementary clause handwritten and attached to the original will, but withheld from the official reading by Mr. Samuel Whitmore's personal request, he said, looking directly at me. I sat frozen, my fingers still gripping the sheet of paper that read, "Learn to be self-reliant." As the room grew heavier with each passing second, as though everyone was holding their breath. Emma furrowed her brow. My mother glanced toward my father, silently asking for an explanation, and my father raised an eyebrow in growing suspicion. Harold opened the envelope and pulled out a letter, written in familiar handwriting slightly slanted, sharp, undeniably my grandfather's. Harold cleared his throat and began reading aloud, each word delivered slowly, as if every sentence had been written with the last beat of a devoted heart. If Alyssa is hearing this, it means I'm no longer here to tell you in person. But know this: not a single day of my life did I ever see you as forgotten. I froze. My hand gripped the side of the chair. My eyes widened. My heart skipped a beat. I saw you grow up in silence. I saw you working your first job at 16. I saw the scholarship applications you submitted, the journal entries you wrote about dreams no one ever asked about, and I stood in the shadows, watching you move forward alone. A lump formed in my throat, rising like a wave. The room around me faded, as Harold's voice continued through the quiet. You never asked for anything, never complained. But that doesn't mean you didn't deserve to receive. That's why I've set aside 40% of the investment fund I began building 15 years ago. Every dollar, every gain I signed in your name, because I believe that one day, you'll know how to use it better than anyone else. My mother clutched her mouth, too stunned to speak. Emma leaned forward, her lips parted as if about to protest. My father shot up from his chair, face flushed red, ready to argue, but Harold silenced him with a single firm gesture. He placed a dark blue leather file in front of me, the words engraved in gold. Alyssa Whitmore Beneficiary Ownership File. The current total valuation of the fund, including equity, assets, and accumulated returns, has been recently appraised at approximately 24 million US dollars. The words dropped into the room like a bomb. A soundless impact only my heart could hear. I stared at the file in front of me as if it weren't real. My vision blurred for a moment, not because of the money, but because of what lay beneath that number. Recognition, protection, and love, quiet, unwavering love from the only person who had ever believed I didn't need to prove my worth to deserve being loved. Harold folded the letter and looked directly at me, his eyes carrying a compassion I had never seen in him before. Mr. Samuel wanted you to know. He never abandoned you. He was simply waiting for the right time to say it, when you were strong enough to understand and independent enough not to be swayed by money. I sat there, saying nothing, yet tears had begun to stream down my face without me realizing it. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel ashamed of letting my emotions show. Because, for the first time, I didn't feel alone. The leather chair my father sat in slammed backward as he jumped to his feet, his face flushed with rage, as if the blood had rushed to his head all at once. He pointed straight at me, his voice cracking like thunder in a room already weighed down like stone. This is impossible. That girl did nothing. She doesn't deserve this. She didn't take care of my father. She's been away. She's done nothing for this family. And now, he gives her everything? His voice splintered into a roar, not just from the loss of inheritance, but from the blow to his pride. He couldn't bear the truth that the daughter he had always dismissed, the silent one, the shadow, had been the one his father trusted most. But Harold stood his ground, unwavering in the face of my father's fury. Calmly, he opened a thick binder filled with fine print and pages of detailed investment records, and he placed it firmly on the table. Every investment, from the first equity fund in 2009 to insurance contracts and smart asset portfolios, was registered under Miss Alyssa Whitmore. Every transaction was signed in Mr. Samuel's hand and fully notarized with legal certification. He slid the binder toward my father, his gaze like a blade. All legal. All clear. And none of it can be contested. My father fell silent. He stared at the numbers in front of him like he couldn't comprehend them. "This is a joke," he muttered, then lifted his eyes to mine, eyes filled with a mix of hatred and disbelief. My mother sat next to him, her hand clutching the edge of her dress, her expression blank, as if the world had flipped upside down and she no longer knew where to place her feet. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked down at the floor, and I wondered, did she feel even the smallest pang of regret? Emma sat across the table, her shoulders trembling slightly. She didn't scream or lash out like Dad. Instead, she slowly removed her glimmering earrings, placed them on the table as if their shine had suddenly become too heavy. Her eyes shimmered with moisture. I expected jealousy. I expected arrogant fury. But what I heard was a small, fragile question, soft, like a child lost in a crowd. "Why did he choose you?" I turned to look at Emma. For the first time in years, I saw her not with resentment or pain, but with something quieter. Distance. As if two worlds that once shared a childhood had drifted so far apart, there was no path back. I took a deep breath, looked her in the eyes, and answered, my voice soft but firm. "Maybe because he saw you as a princess, but he knew I was a warrior." My mother looked to my father, her fingers tightening around her handbag, her face pale. Emma remained still, her eyes wide, as if trying to grasp something that had already slipped away. No one else spoke. There were no more arguments to make. And me? I simply stood. No gloating. No shouting. No need to declare any victory. I gently picked up the folder in front of me and then placed it back on the table. My voice came out low and steady, as if it had been waiting inside me for years. "I don't need to fight for anything, because I know the most valuable thing he left me wasn't the money, it was his trust." I looked straight at my father, the man who had always said I was too serious, too stubborn, too different. The man who used silence to shrink me and favoritism to make me believe I was nothing more than a shadow no one needed. I didn't hate him. I simply looked at him the way you look at an old chapter full of errors, blank spaces, and one you've decided not to reread again. Thank you for teaching me how to be self-reliant, I said, eyes locked with his. Because now, I'm going to live exactly that way. I turned to my mother, the woman who once called me a burden when I said I wanted to study abroad. She was still staring at me, but her eyes were empty. Maybe she was thinking about the lakeside estate they no longer owned. Or maybe she was thinking about Emma, the daughter they had poured everything into, now suddenly so small in the world I was stepping into. I didn't hug anyone. Didn't bow, didn't nod. I simply turned and walked away. My shoes tapped across the old tiled floor, each step echoing through the room like the hush of twilight settling in. But there was no hesitation in my stride. My steps were steady, quiet, and full of certainty, as if, finally, I had stepped out of the invisible cage that had held me prisoner for so many years. And this time, I didn't need anyone to follow me to confirm I was right. I didn't need applause. I didn't need a reluctant nod of approval. I only needed one thing: freedom. And I had just touched it with my own hands. A year passed like an old dream, but not the sorrowful kind I used to flail through. It was a new kind of dream, quiet, free, and startlingly real. I no longer lived in a temporary rental in New York, no longer counted pennies before buying a hot cup of coffee. Now, I run a nonprofit named after him, the Samuel Initiative for Resilient Youth, an education fund for students who've been wounded by their own families. Children whose dreams were never encouraged, who were dismissed, compared, labeled as ungrateful for daring to be different. I was once one of them. And now, I build bridges so others won't have to swim through the same loneliness I did alone. I didn't create this organization out of revenge. I did it because I know what it feels like to be forced to walk in the dark, and I know, even more deeply, the value of a hand that reaches out at the right moment. We fund scholarships, host workshops, connect students with psychological mentors and peer allies. Every time I receive an email that says, "Because of you, I don't feel invisible anymore," I know, he's smiling. 3 months ago, I got an invitation from TED asking me to share my journey on the main stage in Austin. They titled the talk, "The Power of Being the Unchosen." I stood backstage wearing a simple white shirt, a small pin fastened at the collar engraved with the words, "Bright One," the last gift he gave me before he passed. I stepped into the light, and though the spotlight hit me straight in the face, I didn't flinch. I felt safe standing in a space where I no longer had to shrink myself to fit anyone's mold. I spoke about my childhood, about the little gray-painted room, about the awards I brought home that were only met with a flat, "Yeah, we know." I spoke about the empty chair at my college graduation, about the message in the will. Learn to be self-reliant, and the letter he left behind, like a key that finally unlocked the door I had kept shut for years. I said I didn't hate my parents, because if they hadn't done what they did, I wouldn't have grown strong enough to walk this far. I said I was even grateful to those who abandoned me, because they were the reason I never abandoned myself. When I finished the talk, the audience rose in a standing ovation. The sound rippled like waves, not waves from the ocean, but waves of recognition, from hearts that had quietly endured and suddenly saw their own story reflected back to them. I stood there, still for a moment, and I realized. This was the first time in my life I had ever been applauded, without having to become someone else. Last week, I was invited to visit a high school classroom, one of the places where our organization had awarded scholarships to 10 new students. I walked in, soft golden sunlight pouring through the windows, young faces turning to look at me, and then applause. No one told them to do it. No one trained them how. It was instinctive because they felt something in my presence. But now, the world was doing it in their place, and with a sincerity no hollow birthday celebration for my sister could ever match. I no longer need anyone to tell me I'm worthy. I don't need my mother's gaze or my father's nod to validate my existence. Because I've rewritten my story in ink made of courage, on paper folded from old wounds. And I'm not stopping here. Because if he could believe in me when my entire family didn't, then I will believe in those who've been forgotten, those who only need one flicker of light to find their way back to themselves. I sit alone in my small apartment in Austin, where the sunset spills gently through the glass window. Outside, the streets are still alive, people rushing past one another like they're all chasing something they haven't yet learned how to name. In my hands is a photo of my grandfather, in a dark suit, his hand resting on my shoulder when I was 12. He doesn't smile in the picture, but his eyes shine, as if they're saying, "Keep walking, and one day, they'll understand why you didn't stay." I don't resent my family anymore. I don't need to. Because after everything, I've come to understand one truth. Not everyone who gives you life deserves a place in it. Blood doesn't define respect. Genetics don't guarantee love. And sometimes, the only person who truly needs to choose you is you. I used to think justice meant my parents realizing their mistakes, apologizing, clapping for the things I achieved. But now, I understand. Justice doesn't always come from the applause of your family, it comes from the quiet recognition of your own heart. When you know you are enough. When you no longer wait for someone else to say it. When you lift your chin and walk forward, even if no one's behind you to see you off. If you're watching this video and there's a part of you that has ever felt abandoned by your own family, I want you to know you are not alone. I see you, I understand you. And you don't have to keep proving anything. If you still believe you deserve to live a kind, meaningful life, that belief is already enough. If you've ever been made to feel lesser inside your own home, leave a comment. Share your story, even if it's just one line, one wound, or one moment you were left out of a family dinner. Because sometimes, being heard is the first step to healing. And if this story spoke to you, share it. Somewhere out there, someone might need to hear exactly what you just heard. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more healing stories, imperfect journeys, told with pride. Because in the end, even if you walk alone, you still deserve to arrive. Thank you for listening. I'm Alyssa, and I'm not a princess. I'm a survivor. I'm the one who stepped out of the shadows. And I chose myself.